I don't care what you think. Get out of my way right now, or I will have security remove you.
He shamed his ex-wife at the hospital until the surgeon asked her to approve his mother's surgery. May I ask you for a small favor? Please like, subscribe, and watch until the end. Your support helps this channel grow and allows us to keep creating more emotional stories for you. Thank you for being here. You are not family anymore, Niall. Callister Reed said it in the surgical corridor of St. Aurelia Medical Center, as if the sentence had the power to move her out of the light. The hallway was too clean for cruelty, too bright for old wounds. All white walls, polished floors, blue monitor glow, and the low rhythm of machines breathing behind closed doors. At the far end, the operating room entrance held a red light above it, steady and silent. Behind that door, Vivian Reed, Callister's mother, was being prepared for a procedure no one in the family had expected when the night began. Nurses moved quickly but quietly. A hospital administrator spoke into a tablet near the desk. Families sat in stiff chairs with paper cups of untouched coffee. And in the middle of it all, Niall Whitmore stood with a navy folder held against her chest, calm enough to make the entire corridor feel slower. She wore a dark coat over professional hospital clothes, her hair drawn back neatly, her face composed in the way people become when they have spent years learning that panic helps no patient. Callister stood across from her in a tailored charcoal suit, expensive even under fluorescent light, his jaw tight, his eyes full of the old assumption that volume and money could still open every door. Beside him, Briar Winslow held her designer coat closed with one hand, watching Niall as if she were an interruption that had wandered into the wrong floor. "This is a private family matter," Callister said. "My mother is in there. Whatever you think you are doing, stop." Niall looked past him, toward the operating room door, not because she wanted to dismiss him, but because that door mattered more than his pride. "I know who is in there," she said. Her voice was soft, but not fragile. Callister gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Do you? Because the last time I checked, my mother stopped being your concern when our marriage ended." A nurse at the desk lowered her eyes. Briar's mouth curved faintly, encouraged by the cruelty because it was not aimed at her. Niall shifted the folder slightly in her hands. She remembered Vivian's hands from years ago, pearl bracelet against a coffee mug, quiet disapproval whenever Niall came home from a night shift instead of a charity luncheon. She remembered Callister saying she cared too much about strangers, as if compassion were a habit that made her unsuitable for a richer life. Now the same man stood beneath hospital lights, trying to remove her from the one place where compassion had become authority. "You should leave before security has to explain this to you," he said. Niall finally looked at him, not with anger, not with hurt, with the stillness of a woman who had already survived the worst version of his voice. "Before you ask them to remove me," she said, resting one hand on the navy folder, "you should ask the surgeon whose approval he is waiting for." The corridor went quiet enough for Callister to hear the door behind him click. Years before Callister Reed ever learned how small he could make her feel, Niall Whitmore knew how hospitals breathed. Not the way visitors heard them, through distant beeps and rolling carts and careful announcements over the speakers, but the deeper rhythm beneath it all. Nurses changing shifts before sunrise, families sleeping upright in plastic chairs, coordinators fighting with insurance portals, surgeons waiting for clearance, social workers searching for funds that could turn a delayed procedure into a scheduled one. She had learned that rhythm in the years when their marriage still lived in a two-bedroom apartment outside Chicago, long before Callister's company moved into glass offices and his suits began arriving in garment bags instead of department store boxes. Niall worked nights at Mercy North then, 12-hour shifts that often became 14, coming home after dawn with her hair pinned badly, sanitizer dry on her hands, and tenderness stored somewhere behind her tired eyes. Callister would be at the kitchen table with spreadsheets open, talking about expansion, investors, numbers, speed. She would pour coffee, sit across from him, and tell him about the patient whose approval came through at the last minute, or the elderly man who needed someone to call his daughter, or the young mother whose surgery almost got postponed until a charity fund released support. Callister listened at first, or maybe he only liked the sound of being listened to when it was his turn. "You carry too much of other people's pain," he told her one morning, not unkindly yet, but with impatience already forming beneath the words. Niall looked down at the chipped mug between her hands. Someone has to carry it until the system remembers they are people. He smiled then, the way ambitious men smile at things they find beautiful but not useful. You could do so much more if you stopped giving yourself away. She did not answer because she was too tired to explain that care was not the same as surrender. Over time, as Callister's money grew, his patience for her world shrank. He began to hate the missed dinners, the phone calls during holidays, the smell of hospital soap on her sleeves, the way she could not laugh easily at parties after holding someone's hand through fear hours earlier. He wanted evenings with donors, polished photographs, a wife who appeared rested under chandelier light. Niall kept showing up with quiet eyes and comfortable shoes, carrying stories he did not want near the life he was building. The first time he introduced Briar Winslow at a fundraiser, he called her exactly the kind of energy this room needs. Niall heard it from across the ballroom and understood that some replacements begin as compliments given to another woman. Months later, when Callister said their lives were moving in different directions, she thought of every hallway she had walked, every closed door she had waited outside, every family who learned that love sometimes meant staying calm while paperwork decided fate. He thought she was too soft for the world he wanted. He never understood that softness was not what kept her there. Strength did. Callister did not leave Niall in one dramatic moment. He left her in small, polished sentences that made abandonment sound like strategy. By the time the divorce papers appeared on their dining table, his life had already moved into rooms where she felt more like a shadow than a wife. There were fundraising dinners at private clubs, gallery openings for donors, charity luncheons where Briar Winslow laughed at the right volume and wore pearls like they had been invented for her throat. Niall still came when Callister asked, still stood beside him in dresses she bought after double shifts, still smiled when men in expensive jackets asked whether she was still doing hospital work, as if compassion were a hobby she had outgrown too late. Callister stopped correcting them. That hurt more than the questions. Once, years earlier, he would have said, "Niall keeps people alive while the rest of us chase numbers." Now he said nothing, only placed his hand at her lower back and guided her towards someone more useful. The night he finally told her, she had just come home from Mercy North after a difficult shift. Her feet ached. There was a faint crease on her cheek from the mask she had worn for hours. The apartment smelled of takeout he had ordered and barely touched. Callister was standing by the window in a navy suit, looking down at Chicago as if the city had already agreed with him. "We are not becoming the same people," he said. Niall set her hospital bag on the floor. She wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because he made it sound like nature had done this to them. As if ambition had simply grown in one direction and care in another. As if he had not chosen every dinner she missed because he scheduled it during her shifts, every silence he gave when someone belittled her work, every smile he saved for Briar under chandelier light. "Who are you becoming?" she asked. Callister turned from the window. His expression was almost kind, and that made it colder. "Someone who needs a partner who can stand fully in my world." There it was again. His world, not their life. Not the kitchen table where she had listened to his fears before money made him fluent in confidence. He said she was noble, then tired. Admirable, then limited. He said Briar understood the pace of where things were going without saying Briar's name until the silence had already done it for him. Niall did not throw the papers. She did not beg him to remember the years when she carried them both through exhaustion. She picked up the first page, read the settlement terms, and noticed how neatly he had arranged her exit. When she looked up, he seemed relieved that she was being reasonable. That was when something inside her went very still. Not broken. Still. The way a hospital corridor becomes still before a door opens, and everyone learns what kind of courage the next minute will require. After the divorce, Niall did not try to become someone Callister would regret losing. That would have still made him the center of the room, and she had spent too many years measuring her worth by whether he looked back. Instead, she returned to the places where pain did not wait politely for anyone to feel ready. Hospital corridors, waiting rooms, community clinics with coffee gone cold by noon, administrative offices where a single missing signature could delay a surgery, and a single approved grant could change a family's entire morning. At first, she kept working nights at Mercy North, but something inside her had shifted. She no longer only saw the patient in the bed. She saw the system around the bed. The form that arrived late, The insurance denial written in language no frightened family understood, the fund that existed but no one knew how to access, the operating room schedule that could open if the right person called at the right time. She began writing down what people needed after the doctors finished explaining what medicine could do. A ride home, a translator, temporary housing near the hospital, help paying for a procedure before the window of time closed. Her notebook filled with names, phone numbers, crossed-out barriers, and small victories that never made speeches at galas. The first donation to the Whitmore Surgical Access Fund came from a retired teacher whose husband had survived because Niall found a charity slot no one else had checked. It was only $500, folded into an envelope with a handwritten note. Niall cried over it once, alone in her car, then used the money with such care that the next gift came easier. A church group followed, then a local business owner, then a cardiologist who had watched too many patients wait behind paperwork. Over the next 2 years, the fund grew from a drawer of receipts into a registered foundation with a board, audits, and partnerships across 3 hospitals. Niall learned nonprofit compliance, donor relations, surgical scheduling, equipment access policies, and the careful politics of hospital committees. She still wore comfortable shoes. She still listened before speaking. But now, when administrators saw her name on a meeting agenda, they prepared real answers. St. Aurelia Medical Center came later, after Dr. Elias Moreau invited her to advise on a new surgical access program for high-risk patients who fell between insurance categories and emergency classification. The hospital wanted money. Niall asked for accountability. She did not want her name carved across a marble wall. She wanted an approval pathway that did not disappear when wealthy donors stopped watching. By the time the agreement was signed, her foundation funded part of an advanced operating room suite and held oversight authority for specific access decisions. In the documents, her name appeared quietly but firmly. Niall Whitmore, trustee approval required. The words were not glamorous. They did not shine under chandeliers. But they opened doors that money alone could not open fast enough. At St. Aurelia, Niall's name was never the largest thing on the wall. That was intentional. Wealthy donors liked wings named after them, plaques polished under spotlights, photographs with surgeons, applause at luncheons where compassion was served beside salmon and white wine. Niall had sat through enough of those events to know the difference between giving and being seen giving. She chose something quieter. In the hospital's public lobby, the surgical access program was described in clean language about community partnership and equitable care. Her foundation appeared in small print near the bottom of the brochure. But inside the hospital's actual system, the places where decisions moved faster than speeches, her name carried weight. Trustee approval required for special access funding. Whitmore Surgical Access Fund authorization needed for advanced operating room suite use. Board liaison to review exceptional case allocation. The words were dry, almost invisible to anyone who had never waited outside a door with a loved one inside. To Niall, they were mercy given a structure strong enough to survive pressure. Dr. Elias Moreau understood that. He was not sentimental, not in the way people expected surgeons to be when stories wanted easy heroes. He was precise, silver-haired, calm under bright lights. A man who respected hands that did not shake and systems that did not collapse when wealthy families became impatient. During their first working meeting, he had reviewed Niall's proposal without flattery. He questioned the approval pathway, the funding limits, the emergency override clause, and the reporting requirements. Niall answered every question from memory. When he finally closed the file, he looked at her for a long moment and said, "You have built this like someone who has watched the wrong patient wait too long." Niall did not smile. "I have." From then on, the hospital learned to call her not for ceremony, but for decisions. Harriet Cole, the administrator who managed surgical coordination, kept Niall's contact information on a secure list that only a handful of people could access. If a case fell into the narrow space between urgent and unfunded, if a patient needed the advanced suite but the standard approval process would take too long, if a family had money but the case required program authorization because the operating room had been reserved through the foundation's agreement, Niall's phone rang. She did not always say yes. That was what made the yes matter. She asked for medical criteria, scheduling facts, ethical review, and whether another patient would be displaced. She had learned that kindness without boundaries could become another kind of chaos. Months before Vivian Reed arrived at St. Aurelia, Niall had signed an updated access policy that placed the advanced cardiac operating room under joint hospital and foundation oversight during certain high-risk windows. It was a simple page, one signature, one date, no spotlight. Callister would not have noticed it if it had been framed in front of him. He had spent their marriage believing Niall lived too close to suffering to understand power. He never imagined that the very softness he dismissed would one day become a door his money could not open without her. Vivian Reed arrived at St. Aurelia just after 8 on a rainy Tuesday evening, carried into the private wing on a wave of urgent voices, bright lights, and the kind of fear that makes even wealthy people look suddenly ordinary. The rain outside streaked the tall glass windows in silver lines, and the hospital lobby smelled faintly of coffee, antiseptic, and wet wool from coats shaken beneath the entrance canopy. Callister came behind the medical team in a charcoal suit, his tie loosened for the first time that day, one hand gripping his phone as he called people whose names usually made doors open before he reached them. Briar Winslow stayed close to his side in a pale coat, her hair smooth, her diamond earrings catching the fluorescent light, but the polished confidence she wore so easily at galas did not survive long in a corridor where monitors spoke louder than money. Vivian was conscious enough to hear her son's voice, but too tired to answer it with the sharp composure she had always used at family dinners. Her face looked smaller against the white hospital pillow, her pearl bracelet still around one wrist, the same kind she used to wear when Niall came home from night shifts and Vivian asked, with delicate disapproval, whether hospital work ever allowed a wife to look rested. Callister gave his name at the desk, as if it were a password. He asked for Dr. Elias Moreau. He asked for the best room, the fastest team, the clearest answer, and whatever form needed to be signed. He told the nurse cost was not an issue before anyone mentioned money. The nurse did not argue with him. She only typed, made one call, then another, and told him the cardiac team was already reviewing Vivian's case. The word reviewing made his jaw tighten. Callister had spent years building a life where reviewing sounded too close to waiting, and waiting sounded too close to not being important enough. Harriet Cole arrived from surgical coordination with a tablet held against her navy blazer and the calm expression of someone trained to keep fear from spreading across polished floors. She explained that Dr. Moreau believed the advanced operating room suite might be appropriate based on Vivian's risk profile, and that the team was preparing options as quickly as the clinical review allowed. Callister listened until he heard the part he could not control. The suite was under a special access agreement for that evening. There would be trustee authorization before it could be assigned. Trustee authorization, he repeated, his voice dropping. My mother is not applying for a grant. She needs surgery. Harriet's face did not change. The medical team determines care. The access agreement determines use of this specific suite under tonight's allocation. Then call whoever signs it. We have. He looked toward the surgical doors, impatient, frightened, still convinced the hospital had simply not recognized him loudly enough. Briar touched his arm and whispered that everything would be handled, but her hand felt decorative against the size of the moment. Behind the glass, nurses moved in blue gowns. A red light glowed above the entrance. A family down the hall bowed their heads over paper cups of coffee. Callister turned back to Harriet. How long? She is on her way. Her. The word passed through the corridor without a name, too quiet to alarm him, too important to ignore. He did not ask who she was. Men like Callister often believed unnamed people existed only to serve the named ones. Then the elevator chimed at the far end of the private wing. The doors opened, and Niall stepped out wearing a navy coat over hospital attire, a slim folder held against her chest, her expression calm in the way only people familiar with crisis can be calm. For half a second, Callister only stared, offended by the coincidence before he understood it might not be one. Harriet turned toward Niall. First, with recognition and relief, and the entire shape of the night began to change. Niall had taken only 3 steps from the elevator when Callister moved into her path. He did not touch her. Even in fear, he still understood the optics of a public corridor, the nurses at the station, the administrator with a tablet, Briar watching from behind him, the waiting families pretending not to listen. But his body became a wall between Niall and the glowing operating room doors, and Saint Aurelia seemed to hold its breath around that old instinct of his, the instinct to block what he could not control. The red light above the surgical entrance glowed steadily. Behind the glass, a nurse adjusted a monitor screen. Somewhere down the hall, an elevator chimed and then went quiet again. Niall stopped with the navy folder against her chest, her face composed, her shoes planted on the polished floor as if she had expected exactly this. "Why are you here?" Callister asked. His voice was low, but the corridor carried every word. "This is not your concern." Niall looked beyond his shoulder toward the surgical doors. "Your mother is being evaluated for the advanced suite. I know what is happening with my mother." The answer came too fast, too sharp, a man trying to turn fear into command before anyone could see it shaking. Briar stepped closer to him, folding her pale coat tighter over one arm. "Callister," she said softly, but he did not look at her. His attention stayed on Niall, because seeing her there made the night more humiliating than frightening. Vivian Reed needed help. The hospital had called someone, and the someone who arrived was the woman he had once dismissed as too tired, too soft, too close to suffering to belong in his world. "Then you know this is not the time to perform control," Niall said. A nurse behind the desk paused with one hand above the keyboard. Harriet Cole stood a few feet away, tablet lowered now, her expression professional but firm. Callister's jaw tightened. "Do not speak to me like that in front of my family." Niall finally looked at him. "You just told me I am not part of it." The sentence entered the air cleanly. Not loud. Not wounded. Clean. Briar's eyes shifted to Callister, and for the first time that evening, doubt touched the edges of her polished face. Callister noticed, and pride rushed in where shame should have been. "You are my ex-wife," he said. "That is all. Whatever role you think you have here, it ended a long time ago." A woman seated near the wall lowered her paper coffee cup without drinking. One of the younger nurses looked away, as if hearing a private cruelty spoken too publicly. Niall's fingers tightened once around the folder, then relaxed. She had heard versions of that sentence in elegant rooms and legal offices, in the silence after he let strangers reduce her work to charity, in the way he had smiled at Briar across a gala table, while Niall stood beside him like a duty he had outgrown. But here, under fluorescent hospital lights, the sentence no longer had the power to move her. It only revealed him. "Callister," Harriet said carefully, stepping forward. "Miss Whitmore is here because Dr. Moreau requested her presence." He turned on the administrator with the impatience of a man used to service arriving before explanation. "I asked for the surgeon, not a committee." "The surgeon is reviewing your mother's case," Harriet said. "And the operating room suite requires trustee authorization before assignment under tonight's access agreement." Callister gave a short laugh, but it cracked before it reached confidence. "Then get the trustee." Harriet did not blink. "We did." The silence that followed was small but unmistakable. Callister looked back at Niall. His eyes dropped to the navy folder, then rose again, refusing the shape of the answer forming in front of him. "No," he said quieter. "Not her." Niall stepped past him just enough to reach the nurse's station, not pushing, not demanding space, simply taking it as if it had always been hers to enter. She placed the navy folder on the counter with a soft, final sound. The click of its clasp seemed louder than it should have been. Briar's mouth parted slightly. Callister's hand lifted, then lowered, as if even he no longer knew whether he was pointing her away or asking her to explain. Niall opened the folder halfway, revealing the edge of the authorization packet, but she did not slide it forward yet. She let the corridor see the paper before it saw the power. "Before you ask security to remove me," she said, her voice calm enough to make his anger look unfinished, "ask the surgeon whose approval he is waiting for." At the far end of the hall, the operating room door opened. Dr. Elias Moreau stepped out in a white coat over surgical scrubs, a file in his hand, his eyes moving first to Harriet, then to the folder, and finally to Niall. "Miss Whitmore," he said, with formal respect. Callister went still. The word ex-wife had been the last title he thought she owned. The hospital had just used another. Dr. Elias Moreau did not rush when he stepped into the corridor. That was what made the moment heavier. He wore a white coat over surgical scrubs, silver hair neat, file in hand. His expression calm in the practiced way of a man who had learned that panic only made frightened families more afraid. Callister moved toward him immediately, relief and command returning to his face at the sight of someone he believed would finally speak his language. "Dr. Moreau," he said, "tell me what needs to be done. Whatever my mother needs, approve it." The surgeon listened, then looked past him. Not at Breyer. Not at the administrator. At Niall. The hallway seemed to tighten around that choice. "Miss Whitmore," Dr. Moreau said. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Callister stopped. Breyer's hand slipped from the sleeve of her coat. Harriet Cole stood beside the nurse's station without surprise, because she had known the truth before the corridor did. Niall picked up the navy folder and opened it on the counter, her movement steady, almost gentle. "What is the clinical recommendation?" she asked. Dr. Moreau opened the file. "Your former mother-in-law qualifies for the advanced cardiac operating room suite based on risk criteria. The team is prepared. The suite is available for this window. Because the suite is under the Whitmore Surgical Access Fund agreement tonight, trustee authorization is required before we proceed." The word trustee landed harder than any accusation. Callister looked from the surgeon to Niall, then down at the folder as if the paper inside had rewritten the shape of the hospital. "Wait," he said. "You were saying she decides?" Dr. Moreau's voice remained even. "She authorizes access under the fund agreement. Medical decisions remain with the care team." It was precise, professional, devastating. Niall did not look victorious. That almost made it worse for him. She looked focused, the way she had looked years ago after night shifts when he mistook exhaustion for smallness. Harriet placed the authorization form beside the folder. "Miss Whitmore, the time window is limited." Breyer whispered Callister's name, but he did not answer. His face had gone pale beneath the hospital lights. The woman he had called no longer family now stood between his mother and the door he had assumed money could open. "Niall," he said, softer now, but not humble enough to be safe. "This is my mother." She finally looked at him. "I know. Then do not turn this into revenge." Something moved through her eyes then, not anger, but the memory of every time he had called compassion a weakness. She picked up the pen. "Your mother is a patient," she said, "not a punishment." Then she signed her name with a hand that did not tremble. Dr. Moreau accepted the form, gave one respectful nod, and turned toward the operating room doors. The red light above them seemed less like a warning now and more like a threshold. Callister stood in the corridor, surrounded by everything he could afford, and watched the one thing that mattered open because of the woman he had tried to send away. The operating room doors closed behind Dr. Moreau with a soft mechanical sound, and the corridor changed with it. The same white lights remained. The same polished floor reflected the same anxious faces. The same rain pressed against the tall windows at the end of St. Aurelia's private wing. But Callister stood as if the ground beneath him had become unfamiliar. For years, he had believed power was visible. A black card placed on a counter, a name recognized at a desk, a room quieting when he entered. Now the most important door in the building had opened because Niall Whitmore signed one page without raising her voice. Breyer stood beside him, silent in her pale coat, her expression carefully blank, but her eyes kept moving toward Niall as if seeing her for the first time. Harriet Cole gathered the remaining forms and stepped away with professional courtesy, leaving the two former spouses in the kind of silence that did not need witnesses to be public. Callister looked at the navy folder on the counter, then at Niall's hand resting beside it. "You could have said no," he said. His voice was quieter now, but still searching for a way to make her mercy about him. Niall closed the folder. "Yes." The answer landed plainly. No apology. No decoration. Callister swallowed. "Then why did you sign?" Behind him, the red light above the surgical entrance glowed steadily. Niall looked at it for a moment before answering. "Because your mother is a patient. Because Dr. Moreau said the criteria were met. Because that room exists for moments like this." She turned back to him. "Not because you asked." His face tightened, touched by shame, but still too proud to bow fully beneath it. "Niall, I was scared." She nodded once. "I know fear when I see it." For a second, something almost human crossed his expression, something from the man who once sat at a small kitchen table counting dreams before he learned to count status. "Can we talk somewhere private?" he asked. Years ago, private would have pulled her toward him. Private had once meant late-night coffee, tired laughter, two people trying to build a life with borrowed time and grocery store flowers. Later, private became where he reduced her quietly before presenting himself cleanly in public. Now the word felt like a hallway she had already walked through and locked behind her. "No," she said. Briar looked away. Callister stared at Niall as if the word had surprised him more than any signature. "I did not mean what I said earlier." Niall's expression did not harden. It did not soften either. "You have meant it in different ways for years." The truth did not come loudly. It simply stood between them under the hospital lights. Callister lowered his eyes, and for once, there was no room prepared for his pride to sit down. Niall picked up the folder and held it against her side. "When your mother wakes, tell her Dr. Moreau's team moved quickly. Tell her the hospital did what it was supposed to do." She paused, then added, "You do not need to tell her I was here." That hurt him more than accusation would have. He looked toward the operating room door, then back at the woman he had tried to send away from his family's fear. "No," he said again. But this time her name sounded less like a request and more like the first line of regret. She did not answer. She walked toward the elevator, her steps quiet on the polished floor, navy coat moving softly around her knees, the folder tucked against the heart he once mistook for weakness. Behind her, the corridor resumed its breathing. A nurse passed with a chart. Harriet spoke softly into her tablet. Briar remained still. Callister stayed facing the operating room doors, surrounded by everything he could afford and humbled by the one thing he could not buy back. Niall did not save his mother to return to him. She signed because mercy belonged to her, not to the man who needed it. And when the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside without looking back, leaving him beneath the cold white lights to understand that dignity does not ask to be witnessed. It simply leaves the room brighter than it found it.